Well, today we're going to talk about one of these huge beasts from the late 1960s, the 1969 Cadillac Devilles. Now, this was back in the day in which when you bought a Cadillac or a more expensive vehicle, you actually got a physically larger car. These Cadillacs rode atop a 129.5-inch wheelbase, for instance, whereas the Chevrolet Caprice rode atop a 119-inch wheelbase. So you got 10.5 more inches just in the wheelbase when you went from a top trim Chevrolet to a Cadillac. And if you even went up to the Fleetwood 60 Special, you got a vehicle that rode atop a 133-inch wheelbase. So these were enormous vehicles. And 1969 was really a new year in terms of styling for Cadillac. And these vehicles have, well, a number of interesting features that we're going to talk about. More specifically, we're going to talk about the top 10 facts about the 1969 DeVilles. Let me know which ones that you weren't aware of. Put a comment in the comment section. Let's get started with number 10. And at number 10, we have that these vehicles had the largest production V8 that was available in 1969. Now, the engine under hood in the 1969 Cadillacs was Cadillac's exclusive 472 cubic inch V8 that had a 10.5 to 1 compression ratio, made 375 gross horsepower and 525 pound-feet of torque. That torque figure north of 500 pound-feet is just massive. And the great thing about this engine is that it endows these huge vehicles with extremely smooth and I would say relatively lively acceleration. Now, the 472 was introduced in 1968 and it replaced the Cadillac 429 cubic inch V8 from 1967. In 1970, Cadillac would enlarge the 472 cubic inch V8 for the Eldorado only, creating the 500 cubic inch V8, which was 8.2 liters. These 472 cubic inches were 7.7 liters, so just massive. Now, the interesting thing about these is just how smoothly they operate. That was really the principal design feature, and Cadillac tweaked them such that they could be extremely smooth and quiet as well as durable. And I have to say, they really live up to their reputation. When you own one of these vehicles, you'll notice, all the GM V8s from this era are very smooth, but the Cadillacs just have that extra degree of refinement. And there were some Cadillac exclusives. There was always a coolant temperature sensor, for instance, on any General Motors V8 or any engine, for example. But when you got a Cadillac V8, they actually had a separate temperature sensor that was in the cylinder head, and that would alert you in the event the cylinder head temperature was overheating. So you actually had two warning systems, one for the cooling system and one for the cylinder head temperature. There was a sensor in the passenger side, the front of the passenger side cylinder bank, to alert you of that. Now, again, these engines were very durable and reliable, and I have to say they're one of the best V8s that GM produced. They're not overly powerful. 375 gross horsepower sounds like a lot. Remember, that's a gross horsepower rating, not a net horsepower rating. And also, these cars were relatively large, as I mentioned before. So they're not extremely fast, but they certainly acquit themselves well. And the other thing I will say is that Cadillac also, I guess they had some emissions challenges with the engine because in 1969, for example, they had integrated air pumps designed into the cylinder head as opposed to injecting air into the exhaust manifold and having all that exterior piping. This is the only engine that I know of where the air pump is actually injecting air into the cylinder head itself. And I think as a consequence of trying to meet emissions, Cadillac also had these jetted relatively lean because when you first step on the accelerator in these, they don't feel overly powerful. You move away from a stoplight just fine, but you really have to kind of tip into the throttle pretty far, and then all of a sudden it comes alive. And I think that's just because of the jetting that the carburetors have being relatively lean. In any case, that was number 10. Let's move on to number 9. And at number 9, we have that these vehicles had a one-year only steering wheel. Now, in 1967 and 1968, Cadillac had this three-spoke design that had the Cadillac emblem, which had kind of slid down the wheel. I actually think it's a pretty good-looking wheel. Some people don't like the fact that the Cadillac emblem is partway down the steering wheel, but I think it looks handsome. But for 1969, these vehicles got this all-new three-spoke design with the emblem arguably in the right place and a rim blow design. In other words, you would pinch the rim of the steering wheel to honk the horn. There's no way to honk the horn if you touch the horn pad. Now, for whatever reason, Cadillac decided that this design just was not, I guess, great. Perhaps because they had some issues with the rim blow and customers didn't like the rim blow. And they redesigned the steering wheel for 1970, and then that would have 3 areas that you could touch on the horn pad to honk the horn. Now, that wheel would be redesigned for 1971, and at least that 1971 wheel would carry on for a number of years. But for whatever reason, Cadillac was going through these periods in 1969 and 1970 that the steering wheel was only lasting for 1 year in terms of its design. And that is number 9. Let's move on to number 8. And at number 8, we have that you could still get dial-a-cruise in your 1969 Cadillac. Now, what do I mean by dial-a-cruise? Well, take a look here at this photo. Many of us are used to cruise controls where you would flip the switch on and then you would depress a button at the end of the turn signal stalk, and that would activate the cruise control and hold effectively the speed that you set it at. Well, for whatever reason, in the 1969 DeVilles, they still had this dial-a-cruise setup that you see here. And that's one of the strange features about this, because the 69 DeVille and Eldorado shared the same dash. But for whatever reason, if you got cruise control in the Eldorado, you did not get dial-a-cruise. If you got it in the DeVille, you did. And here's the little wheel that you can see. So as opposed to actually setting the speed when you reach the desired speed, you would just move this thumb wheel to whatever speed you wanted, then hit the set button, and the car would accelerate up to that speed, and then you'd have effectively cruise control. Again, I don't know why, but for whatever reason, in 1969, the Eldo and the DeVille had a different philosophy when it came to cruise control. Of course, the dial-a-cruise would soon go away, and that makes sense. I can imagine somebody pressing the cruise button for 75 miles an hour as an example, and they're going 25 miles an hour and having it accelerate all the way up kind of in an, I shouldn't say uncontrolled, but not controlled by the driver fashion. Must have been a little weird. And then also, if you wanted to go and set the cruise control above the speed limit, well, you're kind of explicitly doing that by rotating the dial-a-cruise to a speed that, let's say, is taboo. But I thought that was interesting that for 1 year only, the DeVille and the Eldorado had this different cruise control setup. And, well, that is number 8. Let's move on to number 7. And number 7, we have the wiper control is interestingly placed on these vehicles. It's actually in the door panel. Now, of course, every vehicle during this time frame had wipers, but Cadillac was one of the few that had the wiper control in the door. And you can see here, when you got a Cadillac, you not only got 2-speed wiper standard, you got 3-speed wipers, a low, medium, and a high. Wow. Now, that was something that Chrysler, as an example, also did. They didn't just have a low and a high. When you got a Chrysler, you got 3-speed wipers as well. But having it integrated into the door panel, I thought was a cool feature. And this continued on Cadillacs through, I believe, the 1973 model year, as in 1974, the interiors would be redesigned. Then you get that crappy little joystick that they had in the 1974 Cadillacs, and for a number of years after that. And I have to say that just beyond the wiper control itself in the door panel, this door panel I think is a work of art. It's not using as high a quality materials as the door panels from the earlier 1960s, but I think the theme is especially great. And here, this is a car with the cloth interior trim. I love the cloth on the door panel. I think it just looks extremely classy. Lots of soft touch materials, of course. This is a Cadillac, so no hard plastic here, but just an overall attractive door panel and an interesting wiper control. Let's move on to number 6. And at number 6, we have the 1 year only taillight design associated with these 1969 Cadillacs. And out back, as I mentioned, these 1969 Cadillacs, I think, had a very attractive tail lamp design. It almost looks like it's an extension of the fender, and it wraps around so it's visible from the side. It's a pretty effective design. But one of the problems that Cadillac had was that these tail lamps were just prone to damage, and people were experiencing them breaking. They'd back into things, and even in the assembly plants, sometimes there were complaints that the tail lamps would break because they were just relatively fragile and they were exposed. And so in 1970, Cadillac designers redesigned the tail lamp to, you notice here, be encased basically within metal. So they went from having a rather attractive kind of wraparound design that was all formed in plastic to something that I think was less attractive but was more durable. And again, that was because of customer complaints as well as complaints even from the Cadillac assembly plants that these tail lamps were just getting damaged too easily. And so Cadillac made that design change for the 1970 model year. Let's move on to number 5. And at number 5, we have that these Cadillacs marked a return to the horizontal headlamps. Now, for a number of years, more specifically the 1965 to 1968 model years, Cadillac went actually with the stacked headlamp look that I think was very attractive. But perhaps it wasn't overly Cadillac-y. They weren't the first to go to the stacked headlamps. And by this point, it was kind of becoming more popular across too many different brands. Ford had the stacked headlamp look during this time. Even some Chrysler models had the stacked headlamp look. And my guess is that Cadillac just wanted to return to a face that was very Cadillac in nature and unmistakably Cadillac. And you can see in the 69, you have all those Cadillac kind of hallmarks associated with the design. This big prow on the hood, or kind of the rooftop hood, if you will, large catwalks on either side of that hood, meaning that area between the fender and the protruding hood form that's pretty pronounced on these Cadillacs. You have this huge gaping grille and the very vertical theme on either side with a relatively sharp crease running down the fender. So this is a Cadillac, and it's pretty unmistakable. And my guess is, like I said, that GM designers were seeing the stacked headlamp look proliferate across many other models, including even Pontiac within the GM design house, which also would return to the horizontal headlamps around the same time. So this was the first year for the return to the quad horizontal headlamps, and certainly a very prominent front end on these 69 Cadillacs. Let's move on to number 4. And at number 4, we have that this was the first year for the high back seats in the Deville and Eldorado series. Now, Cadillac had started introducing the kind of high back seats in the Fleetwood series a little bit earlier than this, but for 1968 in the Deville and Eldorado, you actually got very high seats, and the purpose here was to really help tout safety. Cadillac recognized that those relatively low back seats that the Devilles had, as an example, in 1968, I should say the Calais as well, were just not quite as safe as something that had a higher back to it with a headrest. And so Cadillacs got these seats with high headrests and high backs, and it was a bit of a mixed blessing because, yes, they did improve safety, but it did make the interiors feel a bit more claustrophobic, not necessarily for the Deville and the Fleetwood and the Calais, but in the Eldorado, where you had a relatively close couple kind of passenger compartment, despite the fact the car was enormous, it did make the rear seat passengers a little bit claustrophobic because the seats were so large. But again, Cadillac did this because of safety. They were trying to be the safety leader, and it was a good thought. Although I will say the headrests on these cars are almost like a hard plastic. You know, you touch a headrest today and you can squish it and it has some pliability. These are very, very hard. Unnecessarily hard. Not like a brick, but they do have some give to them. But not the amount of give that you would see in headrests today, or what you would expect, or frankly even that you would see in some of the other GM divisions. So not quite sure what was going on there with Cadillac, but overall, again, these have an interesting seat design that was really a first on the Deville, Calais, and Eldorado series for 1969. Let's move on to number 3. And at number 3, we're going to talk about a unique material that you could get in your 1969 Cadillacs. That was the one-year-only Ostrich grain leather. Now take a look at the picture from this particular brochure, and you can see the ostrich grain leather that you could get in your 1969 Cadillac. This is just absolutely nuts. I can't think of many domestic vehicles before or since. I certainly can't think of another Cadillac that had this optional ostrich grain leather. It's crazy, it's wild, it's very late 60s, and I think it was a relatively rare option. I have not seen many of these 69 Cadillacs with it. But it's certainly a cool look, very different from the typical leather that you could get on Cadillacs, before or since. I have no idea what made the designers think that ostrich grain leather was a great idea for these cars, but they did. They put it in there, and again, it was 1 year only. So there you go. Let's move on to number 2. And at number 2, we have that these Cadillacs had their own unique suspension system. Now, many people think that, well, a car that was part of the General Motors series of brands during this time frame, they shared a lot of components. And the truth is they did. A lot of the smaller components like door handles or seat belts, interior trim, sometimes door inners, glass, roof panels, etc., would be shared across the divisions. But interestingly, a lot of the chassis components were pretty unique for this time frame. We already talked about Cadillac having an exclusive 472 cubic inch V8, and that is, well, again, something that you could only get in Cadillacs. You would get a General Motors turbohydromatic transmission, often the 400, turbohydromatic 400 or the 425 in the Eldorado. That was not a Cadillac exclusive. But what was interesting about these vehicles is that Cadillac really designed the suspension systems and the frames. And you can see this because take a look at the photo that you see here. This is the only General Motors car that has this particular front suspension and mounting design, where you've got these strut rods that are going to the control arms and then mounting up front, and you also have a mounting at the radiator support. This was a design that was unlike any other in the General Motors stable. Now, I have to say, in having driven these cars, I don't know that it necessarily endowed these with a better ride than what the other divisions had. The other GM divisions, the rides were pretty good, and I would guess that Cadillac did this because they thought that it was going to provide a more premium experience. I don't know that I would agree that it did. I really can't discern an improvement in ride quality of the Cadillacs over the others. But it was exclusive, it was different, and even the rear ends on the Cadillacs were different. The rear end design was different from the standard GM design. So you did get quite a bit of unique content on Cadillacs. Even the steel wheel design was different on the Cadillacs. They had a bead on the inner and the outer wheel, and that was not true for other GM divisions. It was an exclusive to Cadillac. So you got a lot of these features that, for better or worse, were not things that the customers entirely could appreciate. They were undercar features. You might appreciate it in certain circumstances, but it wasn't like they were so visible they were part of the interior. And I almost wish GM had spent more on some of the interior materials on Cadillacs during these years and the subsequent years, because I think that's where they were really lacking. But GM decided to spend it where they did. Let's finish out with number one. And at number one, we have that the exterior design of the 69 Cadillac was influenced by one of GM's first female designers. Now, one thing that you did not often see when you went into a design studio in the late 1960s were a lot of female designers. It was still a male-dominated field. And yes, there were. GM was one of the first to actually have women in design. That was Harley Earl, Bill Mitchell's predecessor. Bill Mitchell was the GM design vice president from 1959 to 1977. Harley Earl preceded him and brought in what was called at the time the damsels of design. So Harley Earl actually wanted female designers working in the design studios. Now his successor, Bill Mitchell, let's just say, I don't know that he particularly cared for that philosophy, but he somewhat continued it. And one of the designers on the 1969 Cadillacs was a lady by the name of Joan Cladle Creamer. And she sketched a number of front ends on these Cadillacs. Apparently, one day when Bill Mitchell came into the Cadillac studio, he had just a profanity-laced tirade, as was pretty typical for him, is my understanding. And he saw that Joan then Cladle was there in the room and became extremely embarrassed, and then told someone to reassign her to the Olds Interior studio because there were other women in that studio, and he was tired of kind of behaving himself, I guess. But you can see from some of these sketches that Joan Cladle Creamer, she was a very experienced and seasoned designer. She worked at GM and in design on the exteriors for these Cadillacs and some of the interiors for Oldsmobile, then even the Bowtail Riviera before she was recruited by General Electric for their industrial design. And a very talented lady, grew up in Cleveland, graduated from the Cleveland Institute of Arts like quite a few other GM designers, so she had the classical training that other GM designers had and certainly made a contribution. You can tell from the sketches that you can see here that her contributions definitely influenced the front end of the final 1969 design. But again, this was during a time when it was very, very rare to see women in the workplace, in particular in design. And this individual, Joan Cladle Creamer, made a profound experience at GM during her time there. So that concludes the series on the 1969 DeVille. and top 10 facts about it. Which ones did you know? Which ones did you not know? Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.